Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Tom Wilson never thought a simple no could start a war. On his quiet Texas farm, all he wanted was peace, but his new neighbor Bob Davis had other plans. What began as a harmless request for a tractor soon spiraled into theft, sabotage, and a battle for justice. Tom wasn't looking for a fight, but he sure as hell was ready for one. Tom Wilson had never been one for drama. At 42, he had built a quiet, steady life for himself on the 30-acre farm he inherited from his father. Located just outside Austin, Texas, the land had been in his family for generations, and while developers had tried to buy it more times than he could count, Tom never entertained the idea. He preferred the simplicity of his lifestyle. Early mornings spent tending to his crops, long afternoons working on machinery in his barn, and peaceful evenings watching the sun dip below the horizon. Tom was no stranger to hard work. Over the years, he had expanded the farm's operations, investing in a fleet of tractors and other heavy-duty equipment to maintain the land. Some were in constant use, while others, like the older John Deere 8R that sat in the back of his barn, were more of a backup. Functional but not necessary for his current workload. Still, Tom took good care of all his equipment. Every piece had its place and purpose, even if that purpose wasn't immediate. It was early spring when Bob Davis moved into the neighboring property. A man in his mid-40s with a background in construction and real estate, Bob had left city life behind, claiming he wanted a slower, simpler existence. He introduced himself the day he moved in, walking over with a forced grin and a six-pack of beer. Tom, ever the courteous neighbor, accepted the beer, but he could tell right away that Bob was the chatty, over-friendly type, the kind who pried a little too much, spoke just a little too loud, and assumed familiarity too quickly. Their first few conversations were harmless enough, mostly about the area, the unpredictable Texas weather, and how refreshing it was to be away from the city. But it didn't take long before Bob's curiosity shifted toward Tom's farm equipment. On more than one occasion, Tom caught him eyeing the row of tractors lined up beside the barn, his gaze lingering a little too long on the John Deere that sat unused. "Hey, Tom," Bob called out one afternoon, leaning over the fence that separated their properties. "I couldn't help but notice you don't really use that big John Deere back there. What's the story with that?" Tom, standing by his truck, wiped his hands on a rag and glanced toward the barn. "It runs fine, just don't have much need for it at the moment," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Bob nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with that answer. "Man, a machine like that shouldn't be collecting dust. That's a beauty right there. If you're not using it, you ever think about lending it out?" Tom stiffened slightly. He had been expecting this. "I don't really lend out my equipment, Bob. It's expensive, and, no offense, but we don't know each other that well." Bob chuckled, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "No offense taken, just figured I'd ask. Could really use something like that to clear out some of the junk on my property. Save me from renting." Tom shook his head. "Sorry, but I can't do that." Bob's smile faltered for just a second before returning, but something in his eyes had changed, an almost calculating look that made Tom uneasy. "Fair enough," Bob said, clapping the fence. "Figured it was worth a shot." Tom nodded and went back to work, but the interaction left him with an unsettled feeling. He had dealt with pushy people before, and he recognized when someone wasn't used to hearing the word no. Bob might have acted like he was letting it go, but Tom had a gut feeling that this wasn't the last he'd hear about the tractor. And he was right. Over the next few weeks, Bob made it his mission to bring up the tractor at every opportunity. At first, his approach was light-hearted, casual, just a neighbor making friendly conversation. He'd wave Tom down while he was working, lean against the fence, and steer the discussion right back to the John Deere. "You know, Tom, that thing is just sitting there. Seems like a waste," Bob mused one afternoon, sipping a beer while Tom loaded supplies into his truck. Tom barely looked up. "It's not a waste if I plan on using it." Bob let out a dramatic sigh. Yeah, but you're not using it now, right? Just think, if I borrowed it for a couple of days, it'd be a win-win. I get my lot cleared, and you don't have to listen to me keep asking." He chuckled, nudging the fence as if they were sharing some inside joke. Tom didn't laugh. "It's not happening, Bob." Bob grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on, man, we're neighbors. Good neighbors help each other out." Tom turned to face him fully, his patience wearing thin. A good neighbor also respects a no the first time. For a second, Bob didn't say anything. Then he let out a short laugh and held up his hands in surrender. All right, message received." But the message wasn't received. The requests didn't stop. They just changed tactics. Bob started framing it differently, almost as if he was doing Tom a favor. "You ever think about renting it out? I mean, you could make a little extra cash instead of letting it rust," he suggested one morning. Tom shook his head. "It's not rusting. And no, I don't rent out my equipment." Bob tried a different angle. "What about a trade? I've got a pressure washer, top of the line. Or I could do some work around here for you." Tom exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "Bob, I don't need anything. And I don't lend out my equipment. It's not personal, just how I do things." Bob held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes. Then he smiled again. Too wide, too forced. "Sure thing, buddy. Just trying to help." It wasn't just persistence. It was entitlement. Bob wasn't asking anymore. He was pushing, waiting for Tom to cave. One evening, as Tom locked up the barn, he noticed footprints in the dirt leading around the back. His stomach tightened. No one should have been back there. Checking his security cameras, he scrolled through the footage until he found what he was looking for. Bob, walking around the barn, stopping in front of the John Deere, running his hand along the metal. Tom clenched his jaw. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. A few days after Tom spotted Bob snooping around his barn, he made sure to double-check all the locks. The heavy-duty padlocks were still in place, the doors secured, and nothing seemed out of order. But that didn't ease the feeling creeping up his spine. Bob had no reason to be on his property, let alone inspecting his equipment. That wasn't just neighborly curiosity. It was something else. The tire tracks in the dirt didn't match where he had last parked it. His first instinct was to check the cameras, but as he scrolled through the footage, he found nothing. The angle of the cameras covered the barn entrance, but not the tractor itself. Whoever had done this had been careful. If Bob or anyone else decided to trespass again, they wouldn't be able to do it unseen. The following morning, Tom found his first real proof that someone had been inside. The gas cap on the John Deere was loose, and there were fresh smudges on the hood, handprints. Someone had tried to mess with it. Tom had had enough. Marching over to Bob's house, he knocked sharply on the door. It took a moment before Bob answered, his expression a mix of surprise and something else, something almost smug. "Morning, Tom," he said, leaning against the doorframe like he had all the time in the world. Tom didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Have you been on my property?" Bob's brows lifted in exaggerated shock. "Me? What, you think I'm sneaking around your barn?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, man. You sure you didn't just forget where you parked it?" Tom's jaw tightened. "I don't forget things like that. And I don't appreciate people touching my property." Bob held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, if you say so. Maybe you've got some prankster kids running around." Tom's eyes stayed locked onto Bob's. He knew the man was lying. Bob knew it too. But without solid proof, there wasn't much Tom could do. Yet. As he walked away, he didn't miss the smirk tugging at the corner of Bob's mouth. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just getting started. The uneasy feeling had settled deep in Tom's gut, refusing to fade. He had hoped that confronting Bob, even indirectly, would put an end to this nonsense, but something told him that the man wasn't the type to take no for an answer. So, Tom did what he did best. He prepared. That night, he set up a new motion-activated camera inside the barn, hidden in the rafters where no one would notice. If Bob or anyone else tried to get inside again, there would be no way to deny it. 2 nights later, it happened. Tom woke up before dawn, as he always did, and decided to check the cameras before heading out to start his work. As he scrolled through the footage, his stomach dropped. The barn's side door had been forced open around 2 a.m. The lock, which had been perfectly fine the night before, now hung twisted and broken. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. The John Deere was gone. Tom threw on his boots, grabbed his shotgun for good measure, not because he planned on using it, but because he wasn't about to take chances, and stormed out to the barn. The tire tracks were fresh, leading straight off his property. Only one person had been fixated on that tractor. Fury burned through him as he climbed into his truck and followed the tracks. It didn't take long to confirm what he already knew. Less than a mile away, just beyond the tree line, Bob was using his tractor to clear debris from his lot like it belonged to him. Tom pulled up and slammed the truck into park. Bob barely had time to kill the engine before Tom was out of the truck, storming toward him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Tom's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the fire behind it. Bob, to Tom's absolute disbelief, had the audacity to grin. "Morning, neighbor. Figured I'd save you a trip and put this thing to good use. It's been sitting there long enough." Tom's fists clenched at his sides. "You stole my goddamn tractor, Bob." Bob scoffed, shaking his head like Tom was the unreasonable one. "Relax. It's not like I took it for good. Just borrowing it for a bit. You weren't using it anyway." Tom took a step closer, barely restraining himself. "You broke into my barn. You cut my lock. That's not borrowing. That's theft." Bob rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. We're neighbors, Tom. No need to get the law involved. Let's be adults about this." Tom pulled out his phone. Too late for that. Bob's grin faltered as he realized Tom was dead serious. "Hold on now." But Tom had already dialed. "Yeah, I need to report a theft," he said as soon as the dispatcher picked up. "Suspect is still on my property, caught in the act." Bob's face twisted in frustration, but Tom didn't care. He had let this man push too far, and now he was going to learn the hard way that actions had consequences. The cops arrived within 15 minutes, but Bob wasn't arrested, not yet at least. He stood there, arms crossed, while the officers took statements from both men. Tom handed over the security footage from the barn, clear evidence that Bob had broken in and taken the tractor without permission. "Look, I thought we had an arrangement," Bob said smoothly, forcing an easygoing smile. "Tom never used the thing, so I figured he wouldn't mind. I planned on bringing it back." Tom didn't even bother responding. He could see what Bob was doing, playing innocent, twisting the situation just enough to cast doubt, but Tom knew the law was on his side. The officers weren't buying Bob's act either. "This is breaking and entering, theft, and property damage," one of them said. "We're filing a report, and if the owner wants to press charges, you'll be dealing with more than just a warning." Bob's easy smile finally slipped. His jaw tightened and his hands balled into fists. "You're really going through with this, Tom?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. Tom didn't flinch. "Damn right, I am." The officers made Bob return the tractor immediately. They gave him a final warning before leaving, but Tom could feel it. This wasn't over. Bob didn't see this as a mistake. He saw it as a challenge. And Tom was right. The very next morning, Tom found deep scratches along the side of his truck, long, jagged marks running across the paint. He knew exactly who was behind it, but without proof, there was nothing he could do. A few days later, he woke up to find his property littered with trash. Beer cans, broken glass, old scraps of wood. It was dumped all along the driveway, clearly meant to send a message. Then the sabotage started. One night, as Tom was finishing up work, he went to check on his tractors and found that someone had loosened the bolts on the front axle of the John Deere. If he had started it up without noticing, the entire front end could have collapsed. Someone wanted to cause real damage, maybe even hurt him. That was the last straw. Tom reinforced his security, more cameras, better locks, and motion-detecting lights around the property. He filed another report with the police, listing every act of vandalism. He didn't mention Bob by name, but they both knew who was responsible. The officers promised to patrol the area more often, but Tom could tell they weren't going to do much unless they caught Bob in the act. He'd wave from his driveway, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Shame about all the trouble you're having lately," he said one afternoon. "Really makes you wonder who you pissed off." Tom stared him down, keeping his voice level. "I won't let you get away with this." Bob grinned. "Get away with what? You got no proof, neighbor." But Tom had something better than proof. He had patience. He wasn't going to let Bob win. And soon, Bob would push things too far. When that happened, Tom would be ready. The tension between Tom and Bob had reached a boiling point. Tom had spent weeks dealing with the petty sabotage, damaged equipment, trash dumped on his land, even the occasional dead animal suspiciously appearing near his property line. It was a campaign of harassment, meant to wear him down, to make him second-guess pushing back. But if Bob thought Tom was going to break, he had another thing coming. Tom documented everything, every scratch, every loose bolt, every suspicious occurrence. The police had already filed multiple reports, and while Bob hadn't been arrested yet, the officers were keeping a closer eye on him. Bob, however, was getting bolder. He knew the law needed undeniable proof before they could act, and he was careful. Too careful. Then one night, Bob finally crossed the line. It was just after midnight when Tom was jolted awake by the blaring sound of his motion-detecting alarm. He grabbed his phone, quickly pulling up the live camera feed, and his heart slammed against his ribs. Bob was on his property, and he wasn't alone. Two men, probably hired muscle, were standing near the barn while Bob kneeled next to one of Tom's tractors, a toolbox open beside him. The plan was clear. Bob wasn't just sabotaging equipment anymore, he was stealing parts. Tom wasted no time. He called the police, keeping his voice steady, relaying the situation in detail. Then grabbing his shotgun, not to use but to make sure no one tried anything stupid, he stepped outside. The second he flicked on the floodlights, the scene was bathed in harsh white light. Bob's head snapped up, eyes wide, caught in the act. The two men behind him stiffened, their hands twitching toward their belts. Tom didn't raise his weapon, but he made sure they saw it. "You've got about 10 seconds to explain yourselves before the cops get here." Bob recovered quickly, plastering on that smarmy grin. "Tom, buddy, we were just—" "Save it." Tom cut him off, stepping forward. "You broke in again. You're tampering with my equipment again, and this time you brought friends." His voice was like steel. "That's felony territory, Bob." The two men exchanged uneasy glances. They might have been hired for some underhanded work, but they hadn't signed up for a police call in progress. One of them muttered something to the other, and just like that, they bolted, taking off through the fields, disappearing into the darkness. Bob, left standing alone, scowled after them. "Cowards," he muttered under his breath. But his bravado cracked when he heard the distant wail of sirens. The police arrived minutes later, and this time Bob wasn't able to charm his way out of trouble. The officers took one look at the security footage Tom provided, clear as day, showing Bob and his hired goons breaking into the barn, and immediately placed him under arrest. Bob's arrogance finally shattered. "This is bullshit," he shouted as they cuffed him, his face red with fury. "He set me up! This is a setup!" One of the officers shook his head. "Save it for court." As they hauled Bob toward the squad car, he twisted his neck to glare at Tom. "You think this is over? I'll be out in no time, Wilson. You can't—" The officer shoved him into the back seat before he could finish. Tom didn't say anything. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching as Bob's world finally crumbled around him. With Bob in custody, the police launched a full investigation. It turned out Tom wasn't the only victim. Bob had a history of shady dealings, and his so-called business in real estate was riddled with fraudulent claims and disputes. When authorities dug deeper, they found enough evidence of theft, property damage, and even attempted fraud to ensure that Bob wouldn't just be getting a slap on the wrist. This wasn't going to be a simple fine or community service. Bob was looking at real prison time. And Tom. For the first time in months, he finally felt like he could breathe again. Bob's arrest sent shockwaves through the town. Word spread fast in a place like this, and by sunrise, just about everyone knew that the once cocky new neighbor had been hauled off in cuffs. Tom didn't care for gossip, but he was glad people finally saw Bob for what he really was. The investigation moved quickly. The police had all the evidence they needed. Tom's security footage alone was damning. But once they started digging into Bob's past, things unraveled even further. Bob had a history of shady real estate deals, fraudulent property claims, and even a few undisclosed lawsuits in other states. None had resulted in serious jail time before, but this time he had made a crucial mistake. He had picked the wrong man to mess with. Tom cooperated fully with the investigation, handing over every bit of evidence he had. The police even brought in the two men who had run off that night, and under pressure, they spilled everything. Bob had hired them to help him strip parts from Tom's tractor and potentially disable other equipment, hoping to teach him a lesson for not playing along. He had even floated the idea of making it look like vandals had hit the property, trying to throw suspicion elsewhere. That was enough to escalate the charges. Bob wasn't just looking at a simple trespassing or vandalism charge anymore. The DA hit him with grand theft, breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit a crime, and destruction of property. When they factored in his past offenses, it became clear Bob wasn't going to walk away from this with just a fine or probation. The trial came sooner than expected. Bob, still delusional, had insisted he could beat the charges. He hired a lawyer, some smooth-talking guy from Dallas who strutted into the courtroom like he was defending a millionaire. But all the charisma in the world couldn't erase hard evidence. Tom sat in the courtroom, calm and collected, while the prosecution laid everything out. They played the security footage of Bob breaking into the barn, showed the damage reports from the sabotage, and even presented text messages from Bob's phone. Messages that proved he had planned everything out. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. By the time the verdict was read, Bob's cocky facade was long gone. He looked pale, defeated, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, like he still couldn't believe what was happening. Guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hold back. Bob was sentenced to 6 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least 4. He was also ordered to pay over $50,000 in damages and legal fees, a sum that meant he had to sell his house just to cover the costs. Tom sat back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. It was finally over. The neighbors who had once entertained his fast-talking charm suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. His house, once meant to be his escape from the city, was put up for sale before he had even set foot in prison. One day, while fueling up his truck in town, Tom overheard a conversation at the gas station. "Damn shame about Bob," one of the men muttered. "Not really," another replied. "Man had it coming. You don't mess with people's land out here." Tom didn't say anything. He just tipped his hat, paid for his gas, and drove home. For the first time in months, Tom felt a sense of peace return to his land. No more missing tools. No more slashed tires. No more unwanted visitors lurking around his barn. He reinforced his security even more, not out of fear, but as a precaution. He had learned the hard way that some people simply didn't respect boundaries. One evening, as the sun set over his fields, Tom leaned against his truck and watched the horizon, his land, his home. It had weathered the storm, and now, finally, it was his again. In the months following Bob's conviction, life on Tom's farm finally returned to the way it should have been. Peaceful, steady, and without the shadow of a manipulative neighbor trying to scheme his way into what wasn't his. The absence of Bob's constant meddling felt like a weight had been lifted. The air seemed fresher, the quiet of his land deeper. For the first time in a long time, Tom could work in his fields without glancing over his shoulder, wondering what nonsense would come next. Bob's house didn't stay empty for long. A young couple, the Harrisons, bought the place within weeks of it going on the market. They were exactly the kind of neighbors Tom could appreciate. Friendly, but not intrusive. The first time they met, they stopped by just to introduce themselves and ask about the best places in town for supplies, making it clear they had no interest in sticking their noses where they didn't belong. "Well, you're already a step ahead of the last guy," Tom had joked. Mrs. Harrison laughed. "Yeah, the realtor gave us a bit of a warning about the previous owner. Sounds like he didn't exactly leave on the best terms." Tom smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "You could say that." The Harrises respected Tom's property lines, asked permission before walking onto his land, and even offered to help out with odd jobs when they saw him working. It was a stark contrast to Bob's arrogance, and Tom found himself grateful that, for once, the universe had sent him neighbors worth knowing. Occasionally, Tom would hear small updates about Bob's time in prison, mostly through word of mouth in town. It seemed Bob wasn't adjusting well to life behind bars. Apparently, he had tried the same slick-talking routine in prison that he used in the outside world, thinking he could manipulate his way into easier conditions. It didn't take long before he ran into someone who wasn't interested in his charm. Rumor had it that Bob had gotten himself into trouble on the inside. Nothing serious enough to add years to his sentence, but enough to make his stay far less comfortable. Tom didn't waste much time thinking about it. The man had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. Tom had always been a private man, content to mind his own business and expect others to do the same. But this whole ordeal had taught him an important lesson. Some people simply don't respect boundaries, no matter how clearly they're set. So he adapted. Security on his property was tighter than ever. He upgraded his camera system, installed reinforced gates, and even dug a trench along the back edge of his land to prevent anyone from trying to cut through unseen. At first, he thought it might feel excessive, like he was letting Bob's actions change the way he lived. But as time passed, he realized it wasn't about Bob at all. It was about making sure no one else ever tried to take what was his. One crisp autumn morning, Tom was sitting on his porch enjoying a cup of coffee when he heard a car pull up his driveway. To his surprise, it was Deputy Miller, one of the officers who had handled Bob's case from the start. "Morning, Tom," Miller greeted. Stepping out of his cruiser, Tom tipped his hat. "Miller, what brings you out here?" Miller leaned against the railing, glancing out over the fields before speaking. "Just thought you'd want to know. Bob's up for parole in a few years, but the way things are looking, he won't be getting out anytime soon. He's racked up a nice list of violations inside." Tom exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Not surprising." Miller smirked. "Figured you'd say that. Anyway, I also wanted to tell you something else. Your case. It ended up changing how we handle property crimes around here. Used to be, we'd treat stuff like trespassing and equipment theft as minor offenses unless they turned violent. But after everything you documented, the department pushed for stricter enforcement policies. We don't let things slide anymore." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think I'd end up making legal history." Miller chuckled. "Well, you did. You set the precedent, and I'd say the town's better for it." Tom considered that for a moment. He'd fought this battle because it was personal, because he refused to be pushed around by a man who thought he could take whatever he wanted. But if that fight ended up making things better for other landowners in town, he could live with that. That evening, Tom walked out to his barn, running his hand along the side of the John Deere, the very machine that had started this whole mess. It was still in perfect condition, but after everything, he had no desire to use it anymore. It felt like a fitting end, turning something that had nearly been stolen from him into something that could benefit others. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom leaned against the fence, watching over the land his family had worked for generations. Bob had tried to take from him. He had tried to bully and manipulate his way into control. But Tom had stood his ground. And in the end, he hadn't just won. He had set an example for every landowner who would come after him. Because out here in this town, a man's land was his legacy, and no one had the right to take that away.